Welcome. I welcome you. It is once again, and you'll have to excuse me, it's a bit overwhelming being here after all these years. I must mention I'm truly honored to be here to say a few words, but this building was a huge part of my life for many years. Some of you say they had a hard time picturing August Derleth spending his life in a small town, and part of the reason was this place here. They brought in some of the finest speakers from the faculty at UW-Madison, the University of Chicago, and many other places, and this was a lifeline. As much as I loved Sac Prairie, this was a lifeline to other places of sorts, and this was always very special. There were those few times I was asked to say a few words here as well, but it's overwhelming to be here, and it's quite an honor. I should also mention, I hope we can do this again sometime. I can tell you about evening in spring, but I should mention that as I got older, I was a bit of an insomniac, and when I couldn't sleep late at night, one of the places I would go was walking through this park. And that's where I could be found sometimes in the late hours. But I also need to mention, as far as my close friend Hugo Schwenker, who I came to say a few words about, as he got older, as he began to get up there in years, he took on the sacred responsibility of being a lawn keeper, a groundskeeper of sorts. And always at this exact time of the year, he could be seen, he could be seen right outside that window with his wheelbarrow, raking all the leaves. It was very much an institution. He could be seen every year doing this, and being here is a wonderful experience, a bit overwhelming, and that's why. But at any rate, I say it is once again I, August Derleth, and those of you who know my work know of how I wrote in Walden West when struggling with which life path I was to follow, that I found I must choose between going out into the wider world or traveling widely in the microcosmos of Sac Prairie. I wrote in Return to Walden West about my relationship with my fellow villagers of Sac Prairie, Wisconsin, that I walk among them, it often seems increasingly an alien, informed by compassion and understanding, but less content among my fellow men than in the marshes or the hills, on the river, or along a country road at night, where I am closer to coming full circle. I mentioned my close friend Hugo Schwenker. I should say close friend and also constant hiking companion. We could also always be seen together in the hills, the surrounding countryside, certain times around the river. And I need to mention one of our highlights. At certain times of the spring, we would always be out listening for the very first whippoorwill. For those of you out there who may be solitary night walkers, such as Hugo and myself, sometimes we were true solitaries, other times we were solitaries together. Listening for things like that first whippoorwill of the year was always something special. It was a ritual of sorts. You could say it was very near and dear to our hearts, but oftentimes we'd be about looking for the first signs of spring and then later the first signs of fall, and we could be seen together throughout the countryside. I should also mention, as far as our friendship, not only did we share a love of nature, some of you may know this, we shared a love of certain authors, and we truly loved mystery fiction, and our favorite, of course, was Sherlock Holmes. I'm sure some people might still be familiar with Sherlock Holmes from 221 Baker Street. We were both huge fans of Sherlock Holmes, but I should also mention that when we first began having fantasies of solving mysteries on our own, at one time we had a little organization of sorts which Sherlock Holmes was the Mill Creek Regulars. Our little impromptu group was known as the Mill Creek Irregulars. Now, years later, as I began writing, several decades after I became a writer, I had ideas as to writing a series of juvenile books. And this happened at the time I came up with these ideas. Of course, I figured these books should be about the Wisconsin River. I mentioned how Hugo and I were both huge Sherlock Holmes fans, so I decided we would call this series The Mill Creek Irregulars. The first book in the series, which I'm going to share a little bit about, the very first book in the series was called The Moon Tenders. And that book, like others, was near and dear to my heart. Of course, it also took place in Sac Prairie, Wisconsin, another place that was also near and dear. Now, this book is about these two boys in their early teens, 1922, who come up with the fantasy of building a raft and sailing it down the Wisconsin River. Of course, there were many things that stood in our way, among them my mother, and of course she became hysterical when she heard this, and she didn't exactly approve, let's put it that way. One of the other characters in the story was very close to me. He was not a real person as the others were, but he was known as Grandfather Adams. Grandfather Adams was not a real person. He was actually a composite of several people, but more than anything else, he was a projection of this author grown old. In many ways, he would be there to look out for us when no one else would. I'm going to share a brief passage with you. This is from the Moon Tenders, and once again, I might ask you to excuse me, because although this passage takes place late at night, it also happens to take place right outside that very window. From the Moon Tenders. We crossed the railroad tracks and the road beyond and plunged into the Free Thinkers Park, which occupied a whole block of Sac Prairie on the far side. Even with the moon shining, it was dark along the path that wound to the southeast corner of the park. Someone else was on the path coming up from downtown. We almost ran into him. He put out a hand and grabbed me by the arm. It was Grandfather Adams. "Not so fast, old-timer," he said. "I thought you got sent to bed." I looked up into his broad face to see whether there was a smile beneath his mustache. There was. The hat was pushed back on his head. He was stroking his mustache with one finger. "Sure," I said, "but I got out." "I see." Oh, he did not ask how. If I knew him, he would go around and find out for himself. "Grandpa, don't tell on me." He chuckled. "Oh, you let the cat out of the bag yourself. You always do. Where are you off to now?" "We're going down to the harness shop." "And then where?" "Oh, around, down to the river, maybe." "We're building a raft," said Sim. "A raft," echoed Grandfather Adams with a deep laugh. "Oh, I can hear your mother now, old-timer. Next thing it'll be a trip down the river." "Sure," said Sim. I kicked his ankle to shut him up. I figured there was no sense letting that out before we had the raft ready, or we'd never get to go. "Oh, and what's around?" Grandfather asked then, as if he hadn't heard Sim. "Oh, we'll walk down and see how the new bridge is coming, and we'll maybe go up on the island, and if we got time, we'll trade stamps." "You know," I said. You know how it is." "Moon tenders," said Grandfather, shaking his head. Nothing better to do but tend the moon and the stars. I guess that's what it is to be a boy. Oh, get on with you." He let go of me and went on his way to pick up Grandmother at our house and go to his own house next door. "Sometimes I wish I had a grandpa," said Sim. From the Moon Tenders. Hugo and I discovered early on, somewhere between very late teens, very early adulthood, that it was very difficult for us to survive being away from this place for more than very brief periods of time. The longest it was for me was Minneapolis for 9 months after getting out of the University of Wisconsin. I discovered I was miserable and I needed to be near my roots. I wanted to be a writer, and this was where I wanted to write about. This was where my roots were. There was a brief time when Hugo Schwenker actually made a brief sojourn to Milwaukee, which did not last long as well, but we both realized early on that this was where we needed to be. And I'm not certain if it was the nature or this specific nature, as though we might be indigenous to this area, but this was where we needed to be. We needed to be out in the nature, and there were times, I need to add, I record in my journal, which was one of my journals, which was Wisconsin Country, and it was from January the 12th of 1941. There was a great deal of inclement weather, and we would peek our heads outside, would walk around the block perhaps, but it was extremely difficult for us to go out and truly enjoy nature as we were used to. We used to love to hike through the woods year-round. Our favorite trail was the railroad tracks, an old spur another story for another time, but we would be hiking in the woods, and first chance after a number of weeks to actually hike with a break in the inclement weather. And I wrote of this, as I said, in Wisconsin country, January the 12th, 1936. I mentioned our first time in the woods. We're on one of our hikes, which I was speaking of, and the first clearing we come to. Hugo Schwenker observes, on our first clearing, as I should say. Excuse me for a moment. The very first clearing we came to, Hugo Schwenker observed, on January the 12th, 1936, I apologize for that, but Hugo observed that nature was as necessary to some men as opium to the opium eaters. In a manner of speaking, he added, I suppose we're opium eaters of a different kind. The figure was apt. 2 months of winter weather had gone by. 2 months of something close to confinement to houses and village streets, so that the tide of restlessness, the yearning for spring, which is common to all men, rose strongly in such weather, and the need for the woods for seeking nature was clearly manifest. Not that winter keeps any nature lover from the woods, but rather that the season prevents, for the most part, that kind of meditative hiking to which every lover of nature is given. Temperatures between 15 above and 10 or 20 below are not conducive to leisurely walking in woods and meadows. Opium eaters of a different kind, perhaps, though it is not to say that nature is escaped, because every nature lover knows that all is not soothing peace close to the earth, but rather that there is manifest always a ceaseless war, the endless struggle to survive, the marks of which are everywhere to see at all seasons. No, this kind of opium eater has about him a core of inner strength no one else ever has. Something there is that marks his kinship with the earth, something that makes itself manifest in the lingering of an eye upon a bird, the way his body takes the wind, something that rises to quicken the pulse in midwinter at the thought alone of spring. The necessity of nature to him is stronger even than he. Take him away from nature, and an essential part of him will shrivel and die. Oh, there is a parallel, certainly. Opium eaters of a different kind. Nature is the kind of opium that quickens every sense a man has, that enriches and enlivens his appreciation of the earth on which he lives, and to which he ultimately returns as a part to its whole. Perhaps sometime in the not-too-distant future, we could share a few words about the harness shop. Those of you who still know anything about me, of my work, and about my friendship with Hugo, knew that we spent a great deal of time in nature. But Hugo had another life besides that. It was known as the harness shop. It was owned by his father, Bill Schwenker, was a village character of sorts. Bill Schwenker was eventually nicknamed by Hugo and myself Eli, alias the Night Wind. Bill Schwenker ran a wonderful business and oftentimes would interact, not only run his business, but interact with a lot of the villagers. That it became a place where they would come to pass the time. He would come and visit with his customers, sometimes simply with the village characters who would pass by once or twice a day, and would shoot the breeze, as they say. Hugo ended up referring to it as pouring oil. At any rate, I dare say that Hugo and I loved hanging out there because it wasn't nature per se, but it was a wonderful place to learn about the people of the village. This is where I chose to spend my life. Small town to me always seemed the microcosm that reflected the macrocosm, and that was a perfect example. And I dare say we learned as much about life in the harness shop as we did along the river and in the hills, the marshes, and the woods. It was a very special place for us. There were also other fantasies involved with the harness shop. I mentioned it was a special place. I used terms like magic, like enchantment. There was always an air of time past about this special place. Also, sometimes, as far as the fantasy coming true, it was simply a matter of tuning in a Madison area classical radio station. I came into the harness shop just in time for the Schubert C Major Symphony on the air tonight. I've neglected to mention this is from Village Daybook, February the 24th, 1940. I came into the harness shop just in time for the Schubert C Major Symphony on the air tonight. Hugo had all but completed his work and sat quietly on the stepladder beyond the stove. I sat near the workbench where the yellow glow from the green-shaded lamp was brightly pooled. Nearby, moonlight shone through the front windows to lie in pale blue parallelograms on the floor of the shop. The atmosphere of the old building, leather smell in air, moonlight on the floor, and the yellow lamplight on the workbench, Hugo in the half-light and the music flowing, that beautiful melodic symphony which truly, as Hugo said, maketh the heart to sing and the feet to dance, helped to make a perfect integration of place and mood, a harmony of spirit and flesh. After a little while, the sounds of the village street faded, washed away by the outpouring of melody from the radio, and we sat without motion or voice, given to the deathless magic of Schubert. And that was from Village Daybook. So much of this place was a part of our lives, it would be difficult to nutshell it in any way, but I'm going to do my best. I mention in other books such as Walden West and Return to Walden West, not only Hugo and myself, but others would go on adventures of a sort. And in Walden West and Return to Walden West, I refer to these adventures as adventures not of the body at all, but of the spirit. Now, when Hugo and I would go across the river to observe nature, we had to navigate a very high railroad bridge across the Wisconsin River, which perhaps some people might remember. I'm still in mourning over the loss of that one, trust me, but this was no mere bridge. In many ways, it served as a gateway to these adventures I mentioned, those adventures not of the body at all, but of the spirit. There was so much to be found in those hillsides across the river. A brief aside in Walden West, sometimes with Hugo, sometimes with myself. When spring came about, there were rituals we always had. And when spring would come around, there was the time when I needed renewal, and I would go, I refer to it as over the hills. I know it sounds a bit like an old Celtic ballad, but that's a term that I use in Walden West, and oftentimes, whether we'd go separately or together, we would have to navigate this bridge, but it was no mere bridge, it was a gateway. There's a passage in Village Year. It is from March the 29th of 1936, and I wrote, on the very first warm night of spring, Hugo and I stood on the bridge tonight in a south wind bearing up the spring. The sky was bright with stars, Leo above, Arcturus glowing amber in the northeast. And the stars were mirrored in the uneasy face of the water, so that what with reflection and the ice cakes floating down the night's dark, the water appeared as another heaven below. No sound came save for the voices of the river and the faint susurration of the wind. The spring wind that seemed to grow from the star-swept sky in the deep south, from somewhere beyond Orion, great in the heavens there, and carried to us here all the aspects of field and woodland, all the songs of birds in the face of the land and flower soon again. We were oblivious to everything but the wind, leaving us in a dream of spring. If a jacksnipe flew whistling overhead, we were unaware of it. If a killdeer cried, we did not hear it. If a fish cut the water beneath, the sound was lost among the myriad small sounds of the river around the piers. Now, some of these memories are truly from the heart, and I want to share that there were those who believed that Hugo Schwenker and I, in many ways, never totally grew up. There are those who felt that way. There are others, more like myself, who simply believe that we never lost our sense of wonder in this enchanted place. One of these adventures of the spirit I mentioned also from Village Year on April the 10th. After a rain this evening, Hugo and I went into the marshes to enjoy the heavenly odor of every shoot and stem, each bush and tree, bud and blade, all giving off a faint exhalation, and together sweetening and perfuming the air as no man-made scent ever could. The Hyla choir sang full-throated, The brook through the bottoms north of the railroad bridge was up, and the dam Hugo and I had made some days ago inadequate. So we set to it to build another bridge and another, made a lake, raised and lowered water levels, and had 3 splendid falls, a beautiful and musical cascade of water. How pleasant it sounds. I cannot pass a brook without knowing my feet to drag, without wanting to go to it and take sticks, stones, sand, and leaves and build a dam. I hope I will never lose this joy. And I'm going to say myself, seeing as it's not raining and the colors are changing as we speak, some of them are disappearing, I'd like a chance to have yet another look at the upper meadow if possible. But those of you who have a chance to be close to nature, or better yet, have a close friend with similar values to share this love of nature, I urge you to take advantage of it. You're talking to someone here, or you're listening to someone. Trust me, I know I had seen actual species disappear from this landscape of this special and timeless place. So those of you who have a chance to share this gift of nature, especially with a close friend, I urge you to take advantage of it. A few words I will leave you with. This is from a collection known as Rendezvous in a Landscape, and it's simply called The Wind in the Trees. I went out last night away from the radio and left behind me doors and keys. There was nothing inside I cared to hear, but outside was the wind in the trees. Or the wind in the leaves had far more to say, something that would last, something a man could listen to with profit before his little hour was past. The wind up there said something even the smallest cell could understand, and other voices spoke as well, the stars, the dark, the sweet land. And each one said things to remember about living and dying, and nothing about distrust and fears. A man could do better by far to go outside and open his ears. And I thank you so much.